Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss a BBC report which involved an interview with the chair of the Ford Motor Company, revealing that car manufacturers in Britain want more EU regulation because it makes running their business cheaper. But Brexiteers insist that reducing EU regulation saves them money. Something's not right here, is it? But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So I'd like to pick up a couple of themes here. The first is on different regulatory frameworks, and the second is on being a third country with respect to your most important market, which is the main issue really identified by another car manufacturer recently. So one of the main selling points of Brexit was not having to follow EU rules. So why was this presented as a benefit? Well, if we don't have to follow EU rules, which were described as costly, then British businesses could save money, which could be used to generate higher profits and therefore taxes, or pay staff higher wages, or both. Only there was a small flaw in the plan. Regulations for producers exist in order to comply with the standards of the market you're selling in. In other words, British regulations only matter to people selling to the British market. However, 80% of cars built in the UK are intended for sale overseas, mostly to Europe. So it doesn't really matter what regulations the British government decides are suitable for the car industry. They follow the regulations of their export markets. And as by far and away the biggest one is the EU, they're always going to follow EU regulations, whether we're in or out of the EU, in or out of the single market. It's really this simple. If British-based car manufacturers do not build their cars to EU standards, they will not be selling them in the EU. Now, at this point, you may think, well, although, OK, we can see the British government leaving the EU and dropping a load of European regulations isn't going to actually help car manufacturers. Surely it doesn't harm them either. Oh, no, it does. Because it adds quite a lot of cost to the process. The problem is, when you're a business who wants to sell to two different markets, you need to satisfy two different sets of regulations. Take the UKCA mark, for example. So this is the Brexiteers' rather interesting idea as a replacement for the internationally respected CE mark. There are British manufacturers who are right now displaying both the UKCA and the CE mark on their products. They need the CE mark to sell them in Europe. And they've got, because they were told they would need the UKCA mark, they've gone for that as well. The government keep delaying it and they will carry on delaying it. But it means that they are paying twice. They are paying in order to prove that their products comply with two regulatory systems. As yet, as I say, the UKCA mark has not been made mandatory, and it never can be. Not realistic. I'm hoping the next Labour government decides to close it down completely in order to save money for British businesses who are otherwise wasting their time. Because if we dropped it and just decided that the CE mark is good enough, which of course it is, then British producers can drop the red tape and costs associated with complying with the UKCA mark, because they're having to do that on top of complying with the CE mark as well. And this is just one example of how having an extra regulatory system costs businesses more money. One of the ways in which the EU was so good for businesses in European countries, especially the UK, is its streamlined bureaucracy. Far from EU red tape, as the Brexiteers like to say, the EU removed red tape by having just one regulatory system for virtually every producer on the continent. You only needed to worry about others if you exported outside of Europe. Which brings me to this article about the head of Ford, Tim Slatter. He has said that Britain should carry on following EU car regulations in order to avoid extra costs to consumers. To the usual Brexit argument about focusing more on other markets, Slatter says, well, we sell mostly to Europe. He also makes the point that as far as car manufacturing goes, you've got three major regulatory areas. You've got America, you've got Japan, and you've got the EU. And it really makes no difference where we try to focus our efforts. We are having to follow the regulations of the export market anyway. Only we used to decide what the regulations were for Europe. Also, the idea of focusing more on other markets has long since been debunked. You know, look at what happened. Just as an example, look at what happened when we agreed the trade deal with Japan. Japanese businesses promptly withdrew a load of investment from Britain because basically we'd signed up to a deal that allowed Japanese businesses to manufacture in Japan and still sell to the British market without additional costs. So they all just went back to Japan. The result was that our useful trade with Japan decreased. The balance of trade went in the wrong direction from our point of view after we signed the deal with them. Woe betide any Brexiteer who pretends to be surprised when we see the same shift in the balance of trade in the wrong direction with Australia and New Zealand. Actually, mentioning New Zealand, the EU have just signed a trade deal with New Zealand. They didn't have to sell out their farmers to do it. Interesting that, isn't it? But anyway, car manufacturers are particularly concerned by the rules of origin phase of Brexit being ramped up next year. I've spoken about this before. Essentially, in order to qualify for tariff-free trade with the EU, we have to be able to prove that a certain proportion of the product is made in the UK. And this doesn't just mean assembled, it includes sourcing materials and components. These requirements are about to become more difficult to meet, and car manufacturers in particular have been sounding the alarm. Brexiteers are seizing on the idea that this is two-way. Yes, it is. But consider, first, in order for a British producer to meet rules of origin, a certain proportion of their product has to have come from the UK, a single country. In order for an EU-based business to meet our rules of origin, the assembly, materials and components don't just have to have come from the country they're based in, but can be from almost anywhere in Europe. So it's way easier for an EU producer to meet our rules of origin than a British producer to meet theirs. The second problem is with the export market. See, if an EU producer can't, let's say they can't meet our rules of origin, even though it's easier to do so, but, you know, some can't. So they are restricted from selling because they will have tariffs applied to their goods as they're imported into Britain. Just Britain, mind you, not the whole of the UK, because they will still be able to sell to Northern Ireland, no problem. So they are restricted from selling to a bit of one country, a big bit, admittedly, but of one country. But if a British producer cannot meet rules of origin, they will face tariffs on selling to lots of countries which collectively make up the vast majority of the European market. This new Brexit trade barrier being erected is of concern to EU-based car manufacturers who sell to Britain, but is downright alarming to British-based car manufacturers because 80% of their stuff goes abroad and the vast majority of that goes to Europe. Slatter also makes the point that the tariffs coming online in January, which they can't avoid, there's no way of avoiding it, will penalise environmentally friendly cars. This is because we can't source the materials for the cells for electric and hybrid cars in the UK. Now, some Tories are fine with this because they think, like to John Redwood, well, we should just be making more of the more polluting models then, shouldn't we? But that's a dead end. As countries move towards the end of sales of combustion engine vehicles, this trade will fizzle out and die. There might be the odd delay. Some countries indicate it's going to be delayed a year or two. But it's coming. And the only long-term future for any manufacturer is in green technology. America's going hard on this. So is the EU. So are the major economies of Asia. The whole world's on with this. We're just standing to one side going, what do we do then? What are we going to do? You know, what markets are we going to have left if we don't keep up? This isn't just about cars. Car manufacturing is an important part of our manufacturing output, but the principles apply to the production of anything which we want to export. If we invent an extra regulatory framework for businesses to comply with, we just force more red tape and costs onto them. Brexit didn't reduce red tape, it added it. And the more regulations they take off our statute books, ironically, the more red tape they create, because it makes it harder for businesses to prove that their products meet the regulations of their market. You know, if we fail to arrange close trading arrangements with our most important market, we increase the chances of tariffs applying. Tariff-free deals are only tariff-free if certain conditions are met. Way easier to meet those conditions with closer alignment and agreements. And the end of the article was, of course, as it always is, a last word from the government on the issue. The article states that Kemi Badenoch has raised the rules of origin issue with the EU. Unfortunately, as is all too typical of our mainstream media, the author of the article does not add context to this statement. It should have ended by noting that a Conservative minister was complaining about the reality of a trading arrangement that she campaigned and voted for. In complaining about it, the only appropriate response would be, oh dear, how sad, never mind. But there we are, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.